We've seen a lot more urgent and rapid climate action from cities, where mayors and other urban leaders are more willing and able to rise to the challenge compared to national leadership. For example, transport is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in cities, and transport is also something within the control of most cities. So we've seen more and more cities taking action to promote sustainable mobility, like walking and cycling. For instance, in Paris, Mayor Anne Hidalgo has put forward a vision for the 15-minute city in which people can access services and things they need like jobs, stores, and schools on foot or bicycle within 15 minutes. In the UK, several cities like Brighton, Birmingham, and York have announced plans for car-free city centres. And the superblocks in Barcelona are often cited as a good example of how action to promote climate action can also be gender inclusive. So by prioritizing buses and creating more space and making it safer for walking, it benefits women since women are more likely to rely on walking and taking public transport compared to men. And as more cities are trying to increase cycling to reduce transport emissions, the gender gap in cycling is increasingly emerging as an issue that cities must tackle. Last fall, Bogota hosted the first 50-50 More Women on Bikes International Congress, as it's the first city to put gender equity in cycling on the policy agenda. Unsurprisingly, because COVID-19 has led to significant restrictions in mobility at the urban, national, and international level, we've seen a lot of cities taking action to promote safe mobility. So in Bogota and Berlin, we've seen the addition of new temporary protected cycle lanes to support safe cycling and walking. Barcelona also recently made public transport free for all essential workers. And several cities in Latin America, Canada, and the US have been making more and more streets closed to cars and open for people to walk, cycle, run, etc. These measures also have positive climate impacts like reducing air pollution, which we've already seen in cities worldwide that have done so. Meanwhile, in the UK, the government warnings about closing parks and banning outdoor exercise have raised concerns about how privilege really contours people's access to parks and green spaces. And in fact, COVID-19 has magnified how inequality is a comorbidity. It's highlighted the devastating and deadly impacts of austerity in the UK, and it's clear that austerity has exacerbated socioeconomic and regional inequalities, which has in turn exacerbated inequalities in health outcomes. And the climate crisis will amplify these existing interconnected inequalities. There are also glaringly obvious racial disparities that COVID-19 exposes. If you consider how a lot of our key health and social care workers are BMEs, and then look at the emergency measures legislation, like the increased police powers to enforce lockdowns, you can see that that will disproportionately impact BME and migrant communities. The hostile environment policies also adversely impact BME and migrant communities in terms of access to and provision of health and social care and other essential services. And in terms of gender, 67% of the global health workforce is female, and in the UK, women make up 98% of employment in roles with higher risk of exposure to COVID-19 that also pay poverty wages. So not only are they more vulnerable to contracted COVID-19, but also they would be less economically resilient to deal with the fallout. So it's clear that there are two key elements needed for our response to both the climate emergency and COVID-19. First one, devolution, and the second one, an intersectional approach to policymaking. So on the first point, state power has to be more devolved to cities. Urban leaders have been more forthright and decisive than national leaders on responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the climate crisis and COVID-19, we've seen more protectionism from national leaders, while at the urban level, there's a lot more outward-facing global networks of solidarity. But cities need state support, especially in terms of resources and funding, and we need to renegotiate the distribution of power between cities and the state. where more power has been devolved to cities, we've seen that those cities have been more able to take action and implement solutions rapidly. On the second point, we need an intersectional approach to policymaking. An intersectional approach reflects an understanding that there are multiple aspects of identity, such as gender, sexuality, race, religion, age, socioeconomic class, and ability or disability, for example, that interact in complex ways to shape how people experience the world. An intersectional perspective also acknowledges that there are multiple kinds of discriminations and inequalities that are interconnected and therefore cannot be analyzed separately. Intersectionality is important in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis to ensure that existing inequalities don't get further entrenched, because already both COVID-19 and the climate emergency are magnifying existing racial, gender, and socioeconomic inequalities. So to wrap up, we know that cities are capable of more rapid, progressive action compared to national leadership. But there has to be more devolved powers to cities so that they have the resources and the ability to act. And we need an intersectional approach to policymaking in order to enable a just recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and just transition to a more sustainable future. Thank you.
C'est parti. Vas-y.
Okay. So, good afternoon, Remy. It's Jeannie Wollaston here from Birmingham, and I'm delighted to meet you. If you could tell us a little bit about your title and role in the city of Geneva.
Thank you for coming and welcome to Geneva. We have a number of measures in place to deal with climate change, for example, in relation to cars. We have designed small stickers which can be displayed on your windscreen. There are 5 such stickers, each numbered 1 to 5. Cars from the early 2000s are numbered 3, 4 and 5 due to their fuel and diesel emissions. Electric and hybrid vehicles are also taken into account. Where there is an evidence of excessive pollution, these latter 2 types of vehicles can come into the city. Other types of vehicle cannot. There is also the issue of buildings. There are 800 buildings in the town of Geneva that I manage. In these 800 buildings, we are trying, including in older buildings such as schools, we are trying to make them energy neutral buildings so they don't emit any CO2 and are self-sufficient. This means they need to be insulated with 30 centimeters of insulation using wood wool. This means that buildings will be highly energy performant. We then have the issue of planes, which is a lot harder to deal with, as these are national and international legislations, but we are trying to tax them. Currently, plain kerosene is not taxed, and this absolutely needs to be taxed to increase this notion of polluter pays, so it becomes the exact cost that passengers pay and airline companies also pay. This will reduce air travel. The third category is industry. This is quite complicated. We have clockmaking and pharmaceutical industries, and we are managing to get companies to become more ethical. But, however, there will come a time where we need to take coercive measures and impose more strict measures, stopping CO2 emissions. Currently, we are only incentivizing people.
And how
many years have you been working on improving the environment? We made the decisions 10 years ago, but these were relatively informal and mere polite requests. Effectively, we wasted 10 years. We need money to help encourage a reconversion. We need to stop producing electricity with coal Here, we forbid the use of non-renewable energy, energy which doesn't originate from a renewable source. We don't use or generate any energy from fossil fuels, coal, or fuel oil. We don't produce energy with these sources anymore. We only produce energy with photovoltaic cells or hydraulic sources, wind farms, or ground-coupled heat exchangers. So we are no longer dealing with fossil fuels. And this expansion to new energy sources is allowing us to develop new industries. There are more polluting industries which won't thrive, whilst others, from more renewable sources, will grow.
And finally, if Birmingham has over 1 million residents, how do you and how have you in the last 10 years worked with the citizens of Geneva to make the change for efforts?
We are available for future discussions and to go and see what the situation is in Birmingham, to see what the problems are. We all have different problems. It depends on whether cities are isolated in mountainous regions, like here. If cities are windy, these all need to be taken into consideration. We are available to provide solutions and share our technology. Reducing energy usage is the main theme here. We are not trying to encourage the use of new technologies, as there are some which are dangerous. We are also trying to reduce consumption, change fridges and cars for more efficient models, for example. Use public transport, facilitate public transport. This all falls under our attempts at reducing our energy use.
And did you have a target for Geneva to become net zero carbon by a particular year?
10 years ago, we stated that we aimed to achieve this by 2050. Now we are aiming for 2040. This is because temperatures are increasing faster than expected, so we need to review our hypotheses and requirements, and that is why we are focusing on 2040 now. This isn't far off, though, only 20 years away, so we need to get to work.
And that is why we wanted to have Remy with us, because Birmingham said 2035, and I think we are very far behind, so we need your help. But thank you.
Merci.
Thanks for answering these. What do you think are the particular opportunities and indeed the difficulties that cities may have in helping their citizens and communities move to a lower carbon lifestyle?
Well, in some ways, cities are actually pretty well placed. I mean, it's easier to have, in some ways, a shared economy in cities. Transport is potentially easier in cities because the distances are small. Typically, people live in smaller accommodation in cities than they do in the countryside. So in some ways, sustainable living is easier in cities than it is in rural locations. I mean, one thing that cities can't do themselves is provide their own food supplies, for example. So there's a question about, how do you get the nutrition into the city? You can't grow it all really locally, but you can still grow it all sustainably and make sure that it travels in as sustainably as possible.
There are advances being made in that particular respect, aren't there, in terms of cities turning over redundant car parking areas into sort of high density veg growing. I've seen that in the Far East. So I think there are experiments happening, aren't there?
There are experiments happening, and in the long term, we probably are going to be, it's a slightly unnerving thought perhaps, but we probably are going to be shifting our food production to indoor mechanical or factory processes that may not even involve plants as we know them at all, or maybe only for our fruit and vegetables. But I mean, that is probably the most efficient way of doing nutrition, like it or not. Whether we want to go down that road, I'm not totally sure. But there's not much a city can do in terms of planting up small patches of land. The allotments that that we can grow. I mean, you know, that's good. It puts us in touch with our food supply. It's a form of exercise. It can be a form of community. There are lots of good things about allotment growing and people growing things in their own gardens and so on in cities. But in terms of actually providing the food supply for the city, you can barely scratch the surface.
Yeah.